Good morning, everybody. So, I'm Chief Economist at IGD, and if you haven't come across us before, IGD is an education and a training charity that serves the food and grocery industry. We're based in the UK, but we're active all around the world, and our job is dead simple. We try to make the grocery supply chain work better for the benefit of the public. And it could well be that Brexit proves to be the biggest and the most complex supply chain challenge faced by the UK and by Ireland in our lifetime. And that's why we were absolutely delighted to be asked to come and take part in this board beer event. And my job on the programme is to try to give an update on Brexit from the point of view of UK grocery businesses. And I'm also going to try to build on some of the operational challenges which have already been referred to by the previous speakers. So I came to Dublin to talk to a board beer event back in 2016, immediately after the referendum happened. And the year since then has been marked by quite remarkable political instability in the UK. We've had a change of leadership in the governing Conservative Party, and we have a new Prime Minister, Theresa May. She is left-leaning by the standards of her Conservative Party. She's what Mrs Thatcher would probably have called a wet. And the opposition Labour Party has also moved significantly to the left over the last few years. So what we've seen is a shifting of the political centre, and that was made really clear in some of the party manifestos associated with the recent snap election. That election, of course, giving us a very unexpected result, and we now have a minority government reliant on support from other people to pass the legislation that it wants. And that really is not something that we have a lot of experience of in the UK. Generally speaking, our electoral system does tend to give us majority governments. Now, that sense of uncertainty and instability is actually reflected in data that we're picking up from shoppers. We talk to 25,000 shoppers every year in our Shopper Vista programme. And this chart here is giving us some idea of what's worrying UK shoppers at the moment. And as you can see, UK shoppers at the moment worrying about pretty much everything, even stuff that isn't really within their control. But I don't think that British people are uniquely nervous or uniquely ridden with angst. Actually, I would see this vote for Brexit as part of a wider wave of political dissatisfaction and unrest in multiple countries. Catherine did suggest that this wave of unrest might well be dissipating right now, but of course nothing has really changed politically in Europe since last year, so it's not impossible that this unrest, the dissatisfaction, the demonstrations, it's not impossible that those things will return. But immediately after that Brexit referendum, the UK economy actually proved to be amazingly robust. A lot of influential pessimists, people like the ex-Chancellor George Osborne, said that a vote for Brexit would give us an immediate economic downturn, and a bad one. But in fact, performance was pretty good right up to the end of 2016. That said, we've got a number of indicators now suggesting a growing sense of economic weakness within the UK. A mixed picture, obviously. In some ways, the UK economy is still doing really, really well. So labour demand is high, house prices are high, exports are growing, especially food and drink exports. But on balance, the UK economy is weaker now than it was a year ago. And that occurs at a household level as well. That's certainly the view taken by the OBR, which is the government's official forecasting body. They're much less optimistic than they were only a few months ago. Now let's focus in on retail demand. So on this chart, we're looking at annual growth performance for UK stores that sell primarily food and drink. And this is physical stores only, so I've left out the online element. The dark coloured line is your value sales growth. And you can see that's actually been pretty weak over the last couple of years, primarily because of deflation in food and drink. The pale line is your volume sales. So volume sales much healthier than value. And again, that's because of deflation. It's much easier for people to buy more, much easier for them to trade up when prices are falling. And of course, you've got a bit of population growth in there as well, which is always helpful if you're selling food and drink. But notice this change that occurs on the right-hand end of the chart. So volume sales growth, which is the pale line, slows abruptly from late 2016. It's still positive, but really only just positive. And in a slow-moving market like that, obviously it's very difficult for all retailers and all suppliers to grow their volume simultaneously. The only way to do it is to take some share from someone else. And the picture, by the way, very, very similar in non-grocery retail and online retail as well. So we've got a retail slowdown happening across multiple different markets. And I suspect a big part of that is shopper unease about the personal impact of Brexit. And of course, the re-emergence of inflation in the UK. And we can see that inflation pressure coming back here. So on this chart, the dark blue line is all items. That's your background inflation. The pale line is your food and drink inflation. And after a very long and almost unprecedented period of deflation in food and drink, you can see prices now back in positive territory. And on that trajectory, they might well overtake all items inflation and overtake household income as well. And that really would put the pressure onto household budgets. One reason for that, of course, is something we've already referred to, which is currency change. Currency change, of course, playing a powerful role in determining the prices we have to pay for the stuff that we import. The pass-through isn't necessarily direct. Of course, you have things like currency hedging, you have long-term trading deals, that sort of thing. That can delay the effect, but it won't delay forever. You know, you can't hedge indefinitely. Sooner or later, you have to refix at the new price. So here we're looking at the value of sterling versus the euro. And current value is about 20% below that peak that it hit in November of 2015. But what you can see from the chart is actually most of that loss occurred in the months before the Brexit referendum, which was June 2016. So it was actually anticipatory. Since the referendum, it's been more or less level. Not static, but bumping along within fairly limited bounds. So it was actually anticipatory, and hopefully what this means is that our traders are now priced in the effect of Brexit as far as they can. But certainly, continued uncertainty, continued political instability is never good for any currency, and we might well see further changes in the future. Also worth bearing in mind, of course, that the euro is not the only currency that matters. A lot of commodities are traded in dollars, obviously, and sterling depreciation versus the dollar is much more severe than you can see on here. And we can see the effect of that if we look at import pricing. So what we're looking at here is changes in the prices paid by UK food processors for imported ingredients and imported food commodities. And what we're seeing here is that food ingredients imported from beyond the EU have actually seen much stronger inflation than ingredients imported from the EU, presumably because sterling peaked sooner versus the dollar and has fallen further since then. But the relative stability of sterling versus the euro in the last couple of months does suggest that the inflation effect of currency may dissipate in the future. But I don't think that that means that cost pressures on UK businesses are going to ease anytime soon, because there's lots more stuff coming down the track which will add to the cost of doing business in Britain. So things like business rates, commercial rents, higher prices for commodities just generally, rising labour costs because of the living wage, and of course possibly tariff charges as well. So when we did our latest forecast for what the future holds for grocery retail, we've rolled in this idea of strengthening inflation. What we're doing here is creating a 5-year forecast for the value of grocery retail sales in the UK based upon the latest information that we have on Brexit. And you can see that what we've done is we've tried to accommodate high levels of uncertainty with 3 different future scenarios: the high growth, mid growth, and low growth scenarios. And the mid growth scenario, the orange line, is locked in with the official government forecast. So that is the one that most closely matches the current government economic expectation. So you can see growth in 2016 was 1.2% year on year. But looking ahead, we're much more bullish. And in fact, we're much more bullish in our forecast now than we were this time last year. But I should stress, this bullishness is primarily because of inflation. Okay, so we've been much more aggressive in terms of our inflation expectations, and also the spread between the growth paths is much wider than it was before to account for higher political uncertainty. Grocery sales in my country in 2016, £180 billion. So if you apply our growth paths to that known value, that's the result that you get. And after 5 years, at the far right-hand side of the chart, what we can see is a difference there of 42 billion between the high growth and the low growth. Again, because of high levels of uncertainty, high levels of turmoil, and changing inflation inputs. And in fact, the inflation is by far the most influential part of the UK forecasting model, especially when it happens in the early part of the forecasting period, because the inflation impacts tend to be cumulative, of course. So what I've done here is I've taken our mid-growth scenario and I've tried to break it down to show you where the sources of growth are coming from. And what you can see is that the growth that we're expecting over 5 years is almost all going to be coming from inflation. There'll be a small amount of gain there in the middle from population, but we've dialed back our expectations on population to account for reduced immigration as a result of Brexit. And notice, almost no benefit from trading up. And in fact, trading down by nervous consumers might well start to introduce an element of drag to the market over the foreseeable future. So, that's where the market is now. What about trade? In the latest year, the United Kingdom imported roughly 40% of all of the food and drink that was consumed. And even for the items that we can produce domestically, we still imported about 24%. The majority of the food and drink British people eat, obviously, is produced domestically, but clearly that is a high level of import participation. And what it means is that the UK is effectively drawing on productive resources from outside its own borders. And it also means that anything that happens to our currency will inevitably have some sort of inflationary effect. Of all of this food and drink that we're bringing in, about 70% is coming either from the EU or it's being shipped through the EU. But it is a two-way trade, and that's something that the other speakers have already alluded to. The UK is a significant exporter of some items as well. But clearly, it is the EU relationship that is the key trading relationship as far as the United Kingdom is concerned. And our partners in the EU, our partners in Ireland, are helping us to give UK shoppers the choice and the availability and the value that they have come to expect. And from a business point of view, the trading relationship that we have with Europe is actually probably optimal now. So we've got tariff-free access for EU supplies, we have consistent regulations, and of course we have the benefit of those third-party trade deals as well, 50, 60 third-party trade deals agreed on our behalf by the EU, and leaving the EU will mean dropping out of those as well. At this stage, we have absolutely no idea what sort of trading relationships we might have post-Brexit. And there are a lot of possible models out there, but of course, all of them share one thing in common. All of them are less favourable than what we have now. They all involve a degree of loss and compromise. And of course, the final outcome is going to depend not on what the UK government wants, but on the goodwill and the long-term objectives of the remaining EU members. And thus far, EU leaders like Mrs. Merkel or Emmanuel Macron have really not been making positive sounds around trade, which does suggest a high likelihood of leaving the EU without getting a favourable deal. So what would that mean? Well, without some sort of favourable trade deal, some sort of tariff would be imposed on anything that the UK exports to remaining EU members. And that, after all, is standard practice as far as the EU is concerned. One of the things the EU does is create a fence of tariffs around itself, particularly for food and drink. So that would be standard practice as far as they are concerned. And in that case, Irish food businesses would have to pay a tariff on anything that they're importing from the UK. And if that includes some significant or essential ingredient, that could well be a serious issue. And if this happens, if the EU were to impose tariffs on UK exports to Europe, then the UK government would have some pretty tough policy decisions itself. It would have to choose. Does it, A, Does it respond in kind? Does it bring in retaliatory trade barriers on imports for itself? Or does it turn the other cheek and remain unilaterally open to free trade? Either of those options would impact grocery businesses and would ultimately affect UK shoppers. And either one would affect trade with non-EU partners as well, because of course the WTO requires you to treat all partners equally unless you have a formal trade deal in place. Well, the Conservative Manifesto has told us what they favour at the moment. The Conservative Manifesto, page 15, says, when Brexit occurs, we will drop out of the customs union and we will impose tariffs which mirror the current EU scheme. So what would that mean? Well, on this chart here, I've brought out some examples of tariffs imposed by the EU on food imports in 2016. So this is the sort of regime that the UK would seek to copy. And what this means, of course, is that these tariffs would drive up the price paid by importers on anything that they're bringing into the UK from Ireland or from Europe. And that would happen basically overnight. The only question then would become, well, how far would these tariff changes be passed on to the UK shopper? Obviously, this is just a tiny snapshot of what the trade tariff regime actually looks like. And you can download the whole thing from the WTO website if you want. It's absolutely enormous. It goes on for line after line, and a lot of it just doesn't make any sense. So, for example, if you want to import toothbrushes to the EU, there's no tariff. But if you want to bring in dental floss, you have to pay. If you want to bring in lobsters and crabs, you pay a different tariff on each one, but it's not clear why. BWS, free of charge, but mineral water, you have to pay 10%. It makes no sense, and that's even before you start to get onto compound products like ready meals, for example. And of course, tariffs wouldn't be the only barriers to trade that would exist, because non-tariff barriers would slow things up as well. And if we're having tariffs, then your common sense tells you there would be some sort of non-tariff obstacle as well. You would have to have some sort of mechanism for checking and accounting the shipments as they come in, which raises the new question of whether the UK's current customs infrastructure is actually up to the job. Do we have enough customs officers? Are there places to actually park the vehicles when they come into the country? What about bonded storage? All of that stuff has not been discussed. But clearly, any sort of tariff or non-tariff barrier would mean the UK becoming detached or partially detached from those food resources that it's relying on at the moment. So how vulnerable would we be? Well, we can get some idea by drawing on this research. This is some research we call the supply chain benchmark study. And these charts are showing you average stock holding for grocery products at retailer DCs and stores in Europe. It's days cover for finished goods. And the data is for Europe because I wanted a really big sample to make it robust. So you can see that stock holding for chilled and fresh foods in particular is minimal. Probably about 3 days worth of supply in the system overall. And in supply warehousing, more or less the same. So it's about 6 days worth of stock at that level. And that's, in many ways, that's a good thing. There are good reasons why stock holding is quite limited. So it reduces your waste, it reduces your working capital, it makes you more efficient, assuming that your logistics are up to it. And if I was a retailer, I would certainly want my valuable retail space to be used for selling stuff as opposed to storing it. But clearly, that is where the vulnerability lies. If leaving the EU does disrupt logistics, availability for British shoppers would be affected. And it's chilled and fresh that would be the most vulnerable, because the stock turn is fast, the stock holding is low, and a lot of the items are sourced internationally. Now, we could offset that to some extent by increasing stock holding, probably at the lower end of the supply chain, but that would be costly. We might also be able to make some changes there by innovating in pack or product to try and increase product shelf life, but really that's just tinkering around the edges. What we really need is a more comprehensive review of the international supply chain. That would be something that would have to start now. And what I'm talking about is a root and branch review of the supply chain for the UK and Ireland, which would take account of where goods come from, how they travel, the seasonal changes, the lead times, the KPIs, the stock holding, everything. And normally that's the sort of thing we can leave to supply chain specialists because they love that sort of thing. But this would have to be something everybody got involved in. And it would have to be a collaborative cross-supply chain effort as well. One possible solution as far as the UK is concerned is to try to be more self-reliant, to try and source more goods within UK borders. And we have investigated how that resonates with British shoppers. The majority of our shoppers told us that they do think there is a strategic advantage for the UK in trying to be more self-reliant when it comes to food and drink. But they wouldn't necessarily want to pay any more for it. When we asked them, only about 29% of people said they would pay more for food and drink, even though they said buying more of it was essential in a post-Brexit scenario. But when we talk about patriotism, when we talk about buying British with British shoppers, what comes through is they're keen to buy British, but they're not keen to buy British because they're patriotic. The reason they're keen to buy British, when you investigate, is because Britishness resonates on lots of different levels. It means provenance, animal welfare, sustainability, quality, all of that stuff. That's what makes British a powerful, gives British products their traction with British shoppers. And of course, those are things which could equally well be delivered by Irish production as well. And that's all obviously summed up in the Origin Green message from Bord Bia. But if we want to become more self-sufficient, if we want to have more British food and drink on the shelves, what we've got to do is secure current UK supply. We've actually got to look to the viability of British food production itself. We need to ask, well, are British farms in a good state in 2016? Data here from DEFRA. And what we're seeing here is income for English and Welsh farms from farming activity. So the money made from farming is shown on this chart in dark blue. Other businesses is light blue, and various EU subsidies are orange and green. And what we can see here is that overall, British farmers made a loss in the latest year from actual food production activity. And that's not unique to the UK. You see a very similar picture in a lot of European countries as well. Farmers make up for that through the subsidies that they get from the EU. But leaving the EU means dropping out of the subsidy system. And that could well be enough to trigger some sort of significant structural change within UK farming and UK food production. So, I'm done. Before I leave you, I just wanted to show you this chart here. This is my list of the talking points which I hope are going to inform your conversations over the course of the rest of the day, all based on the content that you've just seen, so hopefully all of that makes sense. But just 3 points I want to emphasise to leave you. First, it's not yet certain that Brexit will disrupt trade between the UK and the rest of the EU. But the precautionary principle says assume the worst while hoping for the best. And that's certainly something that the other speakers have said as well. Second point, most people in this room, I suspect, represent Irish exports to the UK. But of course, the UK exports to Ireland as well. So problems with trade will cut both ways. And finally, if you want to have an export relationship with the UK post-Brexit, you've got to plan now. It's less than 2 years away. It's not very long, and shoppers will expect businesses to get it right on day one. Right, that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening.